by the way.
Christine, the color of your wall in the back, Joyce and I took a house for her 18th birthday. That's how we celebrated her 18th birthday, as we opened the squad up. And we painted the inside of the living room that color. And then we had like black masks on the walls from like different cultures. It looked really nice. We were excited with turquoise curtains.
The owner was threatening to take down 2 big double doors here, and that's the color we wanted him to see if he did succeed in that. So.
It looks like that color called atomic orange. I love it.
There's some peach around here that softens it up a little bit, but yeah, it's pretty intense.
Right, welcome everybody. Having some folks filter in. Thanks for being with us this evening. And so as folks filter in, we'll just kind of start easing in and getting started. Today is really juicy. We're doing a training on the emergency situation with our houseless neighbors, getting an update on conditions and also pathways on how we can support, mostly through defensive encampments and squat crews. So we're going to learn a little bit, and we're also hopefully going to be able to step up. So I'm going to start by grounding us into what this is and what we're doing here today. So today, let me share my screen real quick. And by the way, everybody, I'm Shreya, she and they pronouns. You're welcome to introduce yourself. I'm in Oakland. You're welcome to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your pronouns, where you are. As we flow through this evening. So, welcome to our community exchange this fall. I want to start with some basic housekeeping. So this meeting will be recorded and it will be shared with EVPREC members. Again, welcome to use the chat function throughout, so you can start by introducing yourself now. And all throughout this session, you can ask questions. Feel free to drop any resources, connect. And of course, if you want to learn more and get more involved, become a member at evprec.org. We'll also share info with Christine's work and Needa B's work this evening, so you can continue to stay tapped in that way. Our community exchange series is really special because it came out of a series.
We can only see a white screen, just in case. Sorry for interrupting you.
Oh, you don't see my screen share?
Only a white screen.
Oh my word, how about now? What's coming? Oh. I'm gonna try one more time. Let me see what happens. Are you seeing anything?
There it is. Sweet.
Ooh, cool, thank you for the heads up. Okay, folks, well, yeah, thanks so much for that. I'm glad I wasn't speaking to a white screen. Yeah, so welcome. This series came out of 7 weeks of deep diving and community planning that we started at the beginning of COVID. And so as we knew that the landscape was shifting. This is before all of the uprisings this summer. And we knew that we had to be in community to start setting up those ecosystems of support and networks of support that we need. And so we find ourselves here. What we're doing with this series is we're developing our own cooperative ecosystems in order to be able to be resilient in the face of the unknown. Move in. If you're interested in deepening with us, and this is a snapshot of our ecosystem that we worked up together as a group, and if you're interested in deepening with us in understanding this and continuing to synthesize solutions, feel free to tap in as a community owner and as a member. You can do that on the EVPREC website. And we'll be starting up our community owner circles monthly so folks can stay tapped in. Why ecosystems? It's because the powers that was have whole ecosystems of finance and partnership that are ready to do this like mass land grab, very predatory work. And so similarly, we're building regenerative ecosystems here. And so in that space, we hold certain values at EVPREC. So we know that right exchange and solidarity are key. That's what we hope to bring and cultivate in all of our partnerships. Right exchange is also circular and reciprocal. It's not always one-to-one, so we're open to flow, as we'll be doing here today. And so with that, once again, welcome. And once again, use the chat function. Feel free to, drop any questions and we'll weave them into conversation along the way. And thank you for joining us today. With that, I'm gonna hand it off to Noni to introduce our speakers.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Shira, Shreya, Christine, Needa B and I, we are calling in from Oakland, unceded Ohlone territory. And we're gonna talk today a little bit about current land crisis. As you know, we have over 8,000 people living on the streets in Oakland right now, one of the highest numbers in the region. And there was a recent encampment policy passed that is going to have really dire consequences for a lot of people. And so Needa B from the village, who is a really important advocate for our folks, a really important voice and presence in our homeless communities, is going to share more details on the recent ordinance and some of the consequences for humans. And then we're going to get into conversation with Needa and Christine Hernandez, who is one of the newest apprentices at Sustainable Economies Law Center's Radical Real Estate Law School, and a tenant organizer, a former unhoused person. Then around 6:30, we're going to get into a fishbowl conversation around ways that they have experienced helpful support, ways that they have looked at how to support our homeless communities when our cities pull back care. So I will turn it now over to Needa B to share what's going on in our city right now. And Shreya is going to be sharing Needa B's slides. And Needa B, you just let Shreya know when she needs to advance through her slides.
All right, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. Here we go. I'll wait until the slides get started. So as Noni had said, and I just want to thank East Bay Prec for kind of reconfiguring the space to address this huge emergency on our hands. As Noni says, I'd actually lift up the number. There's at least 10,000 people who are homeless in Oakland today. And so what is this encampment management policy that was passed? If we can get the next slide, we call it the encampment mistreatment policy, because that's actually what's happening. If we can get the next slide. So last week on the 20th, Oakland City Council unanimously voted to implement this new encampment management policy. And just so folks can know, 3 city council members went into that meeting with a promise to community that they would vote no on the policy and send it back to the Life Enrichment Committee, which is the city council committee that's supposed to do with life enrichment quality situations across Oakland. And they were going to rewrite it and listen to the hundreds of housed and unhoused folks who voiced opposition to this policy as it was written. And what we do know is that City Council voted unanimously. The 3 folks who had promised to vote no and send it back to committee were bullied by Libby, which is actually her mode of operation as the mayor, is to bully people with political threats. Threats to the work they do, threats to for those of them who have careers in politics, threats to their political career. And because of that, our council people who sided with the people at first compromised. And what happened by doing that is that the people of Oakland were ignored. This policy was informed by a survey that was answered by an overwhelming number of white homeowners who are not necessarily from Oakland. They're recent transplants. So this policy was not written with what unhoused people need in their precarious situation. It was written based on what white homeowners were complaining about, which is not the way you should be writing a policy for a human rights crisis. You're going to keep on hearing these sound bites from your local politicians saying that this policy is compassionate, but it is not. It is grounded in the violations of human rights violations and civil rights abuses of our unhoused neighbors. And all it really does is formalize the ongoing abuses that unhoused folks have been dealing with for years. And these are abuses that the city claims they don't do. They say that they don't evict folks. They do. They say that on the rare occasions that evictions happen, people are housed. That has never happened. They say that there's proper notification given. Sometimes there's no notification given. They say that they send caseworkers out. There are no caseworkers that exist in the city of Oakland for unhoused folks. That position does not even exist. So you're going to be hearing a lot of manicured sound bites from both politicians and landlords and business people who just don't like homeless people. This is really an anti-homeless policy. And when we're talking about Oakland, California, we're also seeing this. This is an anti-Black policy because nearly 80% of the homeless folks in Oakland, California are African American. So this is a deeply racist and a deeply classist policy. Next slide, please. So the main thing, the biggest thing is that this policy would make it illegal for unhoused people to exist in 98% of Oakland. That means that only 2% of Oakland would be made available. The thing is that we don't know what that 2% is. That still has not been clearly defined. So this policy lets people know where they cannot be. It does not tell unhoused people where they can be. This policy also goes against the Center for Disease Control that actually has stated on a federal level that all unhoused encampments need to not happen unless unhoused residents can be properly housed in individual shelters, not in giant encampments, not in congregated or communal shelter bed locations, but in individual units. And the city of Oakland does not have that at all. It never has had that. And so this is actually going against the pandemics, what the Center for Disease Control is saying is a best practice for the pandemic that we're currently in. Next slide, please. So what you see is actually, so this map had to be recreated by the anti-eviction mapping project, because when the Life Enrichment Committee was discussing this policy about 3 weeks ago, and this map popped up, the public's response was a gasp. Everything you see that is red is where homeless people will not be allowed to exist. I want you guys to really think about that. That's pretty much all of Oakland. What they're saying is that unhoused people can't be 50 feet away from a residential neighborhood. That's pretty much all of Oakland. 50 feet away from businesses, 50 feet away from parks, 50 feet away from waterways, 150 feet away from any schools, and absolutely no medians. That people can only be on one side of the street in the areas where people will be allowed to be in, right? And that area has yet to be defined. It's kind of shocking when you really take it in, right? Because it all sounds good that, oh, we shouldn't have homeless people near where residential people live. We shouldn't have homeless people near businesses. We shouldn't have homeless people near parks, near schools, near waterways. That's literally all of Oakland. And so the green areas are called low sensitivity areas. Within the green areas, what they're saying is unhoused folks can exist if they follow rules. And the rules are based on these so-called health and safety guidelines. For example, that policy now, because the policy passed, it now makes it illegal for unhoused folks to use propane or generators or to tap into electrical poles. Keep in mind, these are all ways for unhoused people to survive. What is not in the policy is an intervention. saying that, okay, we think propane and generators and tapping into poles is not safe. Therefore, you shouldn't use them. Instead of saying, so let's help you get like solar panels. That's not in there. Let's help figure out how we can get you electricity in a safe way. That's not in there. It literally goes from 0 to evict you. There's no intervention. So all the safety and health concerns that are listed as reasons to get rid of folks in the areas that are low sensitivity. So again, the green areas are where unhoused folks might be able to exist once the city determines those areas, and only can exist if they follow health and safety rules. But there's no support in getting folks to follow those health and safety rules. And so why is this an issue? So for example, let's say you're a housed person, you live in a building that is not up to code. There would be what's called an abatement process, where you would get a whole process of, okay, you do not fulfill these codes. These are the things that you need to do in order to get your building up to code. We're going to give you X amount of time to do it. Here are the departments you should talk to get support into meeting these codes. We'll do another check-in and see if you've gotten there yet. There's a whole process with support along the way for people who live in houses, for people who utilize warehouses, for people who have retail spots. This policy does not do that for unhoused people. And we're talking about folks who are literally on the brink of survival. And so it's really unfair. It's really cruel, actually. And it's absolutely not compassionate. Any questions before I move on? Before we move on? Or we can get that later, right? You're going to put those in the text or the chat? Okay. So we can go into the next thing. So I want folks to really understand about what happens during a curbside eviction. More oftentimes than not, and we just lost the screen, by the way. More oftentimes than not, there is not adequate notice that the eviction is going to happen, number one. Number two, police are used and the Department of Public Works are used. Let me even rewind before that. So most often people don't get the adequate notices. And keep in mind that we also have folks, when the notices are posted, they're usually only in English. Again, the city of Oakland will tell you otherwise, that they put the notices up for a month in advance, that they were in 5 different languages. I am telling you, as somebody who has been to hundreds of evictions since 2016, that doesn't happen. So then the day eviction happens. There were no social workers out there, because like I said, that position doesn't exist. There were no social workers out there. Housing navigators, which do exist, are not out there. They have not navigated people out of their tents or out of their RVs into adequate housing. That has not happened. The city says it does happen and that it will continue to happen. It has never happened, and I doubt it will happen in the future. And then the police are used. And so let's keep in mind that homeless folks are already a criminalized population. We're dealing with folks who are in poverty. And we know that a majority of people who have criminal records are actually have done crimes of poverty. They're not violent criminals. The mass majority of people who have criminal records are not doing violent crimes. They're doing crimes to survive because they're poor. And so this is a population that already is criminalized because of poverty. And when police show up, you can, if you are on parole or probation, you will automatically go to jail just by being in the same vicinity as a cop. If a cop sees you and comes up to you and runs your name and you have parole or probation paperwork, you are automatically in violation. You don't have to be doing a crime. Your existence is criminal. And so what that means for unhoused folks is that they can automatically go to jail or prison just by being in the vicinity of a cop, which means that for some folks, that could be their 3rd strike. For some folks, that means they could be getting a mandatory minimum. And so we're talking about a population that can't even resist evictions. Most unhoused folks, when the evictions happen, they disappear because when the cops show up, they show up in force. Keep in mind, we are in a defund OPD, defund police moment, political moment, where the overwhelming cry, not just in Oakland, not just in Alameda, but across the country, is to defund the police. This policy actually puts more money into the police when the city council just unanimously voted last month to defund the police. So it's like a total hypocrisy contradiction. What's also, the funds is also going towards the Department of Public Works, who are supposed to be cleaning up trash, doing abatement of graffiti. Their main job from, for the past 4 or 5 years has been to bulldoze encampments and to throw away people's property. And so what happens is the police show up, everyone freaks out. The police say, okay, you got 5 minutes to get all your stuff. And people are freaking out. Keep in mind, let's say that you got a notice, a 72-hour notice, or no notice at all, that you were going to be evicted from your home. You had 72 hours, if you're lucky, to know that the cops, that the sheriff is coming to evict you from your home, or you don't get any notice at all. What would you do? Most people go into trauma mode. Most people shut down. Most people freak out. Most people have nervous breakdowns. That's what's happening in these evictions. People are disappearing because of the cops. People are having nervous breakdowns right there. People are shutting down. They don't know what to do. They're just frozen. This is what's happening in these evictions. And so in the midst of that, cops are yelling at people, you have 5 minutes, you got 30 minutes, get your stuff. And then folks are lucky if the cops actually keep their word. Because what usually happens is people are like, okay, let me grab this bag. And then they walk off the scene. And as soon as they walk off the scene, they're thinking they're gonna come back and get their next bag, or they're gonna come back and get their tent. The yellow caution tape's already up. Folks can't go back to get their belongings. What ends up getting lost? Photos, medication, IDs, work uniforms, school schedules. I mean, you name it. Think about what's in your house. This is what's in people's encampments. And so it's causing setback after setback. So it's not just a mental setback, it becomes an economic setback. It becomes a quality of life setback. Now people have to figure out, how am I going to get to work when I have no clothes to wear? I've seen so many situations where people got fired because their uniforms got thrown away. I've seen so many people not be able to get to work because their Clipper car got thrown away. I've seen so many people get set back because their medical papers got thrown away. I've seen people's medication get thrown away. And then that's a whole nother crisis we have to deal with. And then what happens is complete destruction. Everything is totaled. But the property isn't ever actually cleaned. What has happened is everything is demolished and plenty of trash is left behind. What you're going to hear the city say. So that's kind of what's happening when we're talking about an encampment eviction. And that happens all the time, despite the lies that the cities say they don't evict people. And there's also what the city's going to keep on saying, and what they say, that they provide people with adequate shelter, that they help provide folks to get into housing. That is not true. I am telling you, they are really lying. That is not true. What the city, when advocates show up and start making noise, is when those offers for shelter start happening, but it's not adequate. Two days or a week in a homeless shelter is not adequate shelter. It does not replace the stability someone was able to etch for themselves among a community and a network of people in a neighborhood that most people, 80% of the people who are homeless in Oakland are homeless in the neighborhoods they grew up with. And so they're not leaving those neighborhoods for a reason. You know, I'm unhoused myself, and people are like, why don't you just leave already? Where am I gonna go? I'm literally gonna be 50 years old in 2 months. Where the hell do I go to start over? 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I could pick up and go and start over. I'm almost 50 years old. I have a 30-year-old business here in Oakland that's successful. My business is still successful. I just can't afford to live here, you know? And so people are not leaving the neighborhoods where their families and friends are from. And so to evict someone from that place is actually, again, causing another set of setbacks. And temporary, yes.
Yeah, when you're ready to tie it up, we can, and then we'll move into the fishbowl.
Okay, let's go on to the next thing. One thing I want to say with First They Came for the Homeless, that's a saying that came out of Nazi Germany. If folks don't know, so the Gestapo was the military arm of the Nazis. And as many people know, they were rounding up people and putting them in these places called ghettos. Ghetto is a German word. It actually means a place that is void of resources, void of deeply mired in poverty, militarized, and there's no way out. And so when they first started doing this in Nazi Germany, the first group they took were not the Jews. The first group they took were the homeless. Then they took the sick and the invalid. Then they took the seniors. Then they took the gypsies. Then they took the Muslims. The very last group they took were the Jews. And so I want folks to think about this, that, you know, this is hearkening that, because what they're creating are the new ghettos for the new Oakland. The areas in that map, the green areas, a majority of the areas that the city is actually looking at, behind the airport, the army base, behind the Port of Oakland, are completely desolate and isolated. There are no public transportation, there's no markets, there's nothing. And so these are new ghettos that they're forming. But this is also part of the tradition that we see in the US, that people will, they've done it to the undocumented folks. We've already seen that happening. They've done it to Muslims. We already know they've started doing that since 9/11. This is what they've done to Native Americans with the reservations. This is what they've done with Africans when they were stolen and put on plantations. So this is actually part of the fascism that is the web of the United States. And we have to keep in mind that this is happening during a particular era of American fascism. So what kind of impact will this have on human life? Next thing. Again, like I said, it was informed by white homeowners. So who is going to be impacted are the primarily African-American folks in poverty that do not own land. It will be harming humans. There's no healing involved, and there is no housing involved. It's deeply racist and classist. And like I said, it's got massive human rights violation and civil rights violations. So you can expect a whole lot of lawsuits to be coming up again. This is not a solution. It's a cosmetic Band-Aid that makes homelessness disappear. Keep in mind that we're on the brink of another wave of evictions post-COVID, once the moratorium stopped. And we're not going to realize how bad it really is, how deep the inequity of housing is, because they're finding places to hide homeless people now. So when those COVID evictions happen, those folks are going to be immediately hidden. We're not going to see how bad it is. And like I said, these are the new ghettos of Oakland, for the new Oakland. And why this is important to know is how the city has been able to get away with this is because what homeless people go through is invisible to the housed population. Folks aren't aware of what happens in the streets. And so this is why it's so important for everyone out here that's saying each one teach one. Folks need to let their communities know how bad this really is. Next slide. And so I just want to talk about the Stop the EMP Coalition was the group that came together to stop this policy. And because we weren't able to stop this policy doesn't mean we're done and over. We actually have gotten bigger. We're a coalition of unsheltered residents, advocates, housed allies, and organizations, and we will continue to fight against this policy. Next slide. These are all the organizations that are part of this policy, a part of this coalition. Our next step is to do eviction defense trainings and also trainings for how to move folks into spaces that are not being used. Empty homes, empty buildings. And so folks can type HOMESNOW as you see it right there, capitals, no spaces, to 797979. That'll put you directly into our emergency text blast system. Whenever there's an action, whenever there's a training for how to do an eviction defense, whenever there's a training for adverse possession or for squats, you will be notified. Right today, there was an eviction for Wood Street, the biggest tent city and one of the most historic tent cities in Oakland that existed before the housing crisis and homeless state of emergency even happened. The founders of that, the OGs of that encampment, were evicted today, which is going to create immense disablement for the rest of the community. And I think that was the last slide, right?
Wow. Needa, thank you for sharing that. We at EBPREC, we don't involve ourselves in suffering porn, if you will. This is not for spectators. This is for those of us who are submitting to our obligation that we witness what's happening to our neighbors and that we hear them as our leaders for their future. So I appreciate your leadership, Needa. And I want to move now into a conversation between you, myself, and Christine. And as we do so, please drop your questions into the chat and we'll do our best to weave those in. I just want to start with where you left off, Needa. Hi, Boo Boo. This is Christine's granddaughter. I want to daughter. I want to start where you left off, just from a few conversations we've had over a couple of years. You mentioned that one of the oldest housing encampments in Oakland, those original people who, if folks don't understand, they built social structure out. They build culture and they guide our homeless neighbors on what to do and how to be, and they build cohesion and coherence. So you think of that as the removal of one of the oldest neighbors in your neighborhood, and think about how that will destroy your social structure if your elder is removed from a neighborhood. So I'm interested, Christine and Needa, how you think stability is maintained or not maintained, how this affects actual social relationships that exist, that are invisible to us, but exist among our unhoused neighbors when the elders in the village, when the people who provide guidance and social support, how this is a safety net, these folks. Talk, both of you guys, because I know Christine supported a family while she was unhoused, and you're supporting 50 or 100 families. So just to characterize a little bit further the consequence of evicting families and social networks.
So one thing to think about is that the folks that we're talking about who are being displaced from, right now, let's say the Wood Street encampment, they were already displaced from their homes in West Oakland. So they were kicked out of their homes. They lost their housing, their permanent housing in West Oakland, and ended up on Wood Street. And this group of folks includes people who have been in negotiation with the city of Oakland.
Did you freeze? I think we lost you. Okay. I'll put the question to you, Christine. Having been formerly unhoused and then moving into a few squats to keep your family safe, why did you go that far?
So I want to say real quick that I got a lot of people in the room. So, hey, everybody. And a lot of the people that are joining maybe this conversation for the first time, because I invited them, are here because they were incredibly instrumental. There's Jada. Incredibly instrumental in my family being able to find a path forward. And I would challenge listeners to consider the fact that a lot of people so when you look around and you see unhoused people, I really appreciate what Needa B had to say. There are a lot of people that are on the street that you see, and then there are so many homeless in addition to that you do not see. And there's good reason that you don't see them, because the threat is very real. I can give some examples for our family, some of the things that we navigated that were almost really almost debilitating. Certain situations and circumstances that came up that made it almost impossible for us to keep pushing on and pushing ahead. And one of them was, so we had 2 squats. The second situation involved a whole house full of people. And one of the threats that the former owner made was that he would call Child Protective Services. Now, that actually did end up happening, where we had Child Protective Services come to our home, open our refrigerator, interview all of us. That's exactly why there are so many invisible homeless, because if I'm still sheltering my family and having a hard time keeping my children. If I were on the street and trying to shelter them, we would just be so incredibly vulnerable, and it would be really hard. And I'm having a hard time focusing because my neighbor Jada is like right in my view.
So I want to use that opportunity to move on to this topic of defensive encampments, right? Mm-hmm. Because how do you, and what is the plan for? So these are two questions, right? If you are exposed in homeless encampments in tent cities to the wills and the whims of police officers, of city workers, define what a defensive encampment is, and how does that support your safety? I'll start with Needa. You're muted, Needa.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So a defense of an encampment literally is going to rely on housed folks showing up for unhoused neighbors. Like I had said earlier, you know, unhoused folks are already criminalized. People are already dealing with probation and parole violations. And so we are a population. I don't have a record, so I don't say me, you know, but a lot of my brothers and sisters out there don't have the ability to defend themselves against an eviction because they'll land them in jail. The very act of just resisting an eviction becomes criminal. And so what an eviction defense looks like is housed folks showing up. And we've had successful ones, which required some of us to do drastic things, which I'm not going to share on here because that's a strategy that, you know, doesn't need to be made public. In the trainings that we're going to be giving, there'll be very specific tactics that are shared with people who are interested in engaging with successful eviction defense. But there's different layers to it. Part of it is documenting what's happening so that lawsuits can be filed. There's certain things that are in violation of the Constitution of the US that consistently happen. We currently have 7 civil rights lawsuits that are open and active. And they've happened because people were able to document what happened in these unlawful evictions, in these human rights and civil rights abuse evictions. And so documentation is part of it. Another part of it is just numbers. So the Wood Street encampment was supposed to be evicted 2 weeks ago, this latest eviction. They've tried to evict Wood Street for years now. And what's always stopped the sheriff or the OPD, depending on what agency gets activated, from actually successfully evicting anybody is when house folks show up and block it and refuse to allow it to happen. And so 2 weeks ago is when they attempted this last time. And for almost, a week and a half, there were bodies there every day, faithfully, starting at 8 a.m. People took turns. They did an 8 a.m. shift, an 11 a.m. shift, a 2 p.m. shift. And the sheriffs couldn't get through. And they waited until everything kind of subsided, which was today, and they took it over. So, people showing up is really important. And then like on a moment like today, had we been prepared, had there been enough numbers, we would have had people there to actually escalate the tactics to successfully stop them from actually coming in. But yeah.
Christine, have you ever seen defensive encampment successful work? In my very, very minimal experience, even paying attention as a house resident, it's so easy to lose track of this happening. The law enforcement and city workers wait until the house residents run out of steam and then kind of slide in. Have either of you seen this be a successful tactic that keeps people safe long enough to do what they need to do?
Well, I know that, yeah, that's exactly what happens is when the housed folks stop showing up, when, enough time has subsided and we feel like it's a victory, that's when they strike. And so part of this next wave of evictions that's about to hit Oakland is creating a pool of housed residents who can, adding to the current pool we have to multiply our numbers. so that this can be sustainable. You know, like I said, we were able at this time to hold them off for almost 2 weeks. You know, so we can sustain an eviction defense for 2 weeks, but we need more numbers so that we can sustain it beyond 2 weeks. And then it's going to be happening multiple places at once, most likely. It won't just be one encampment at a time.
Exactly.
We're talking about multiple places simultaneously.
What's that number they can dial again to be queued into this process? Give us the number again, Needa.
Sure. The number you're going to text is 79.
I think it's 79.
Yep.
7979. Is
yes,
that correct?
It is. I see it on the, yeah, there it is. It's on the chat. HOMESNOW, all caps, one word, to 797979. And you will be notified of any trainings and any evictions.
Yeah.
And thank you for answering that, Needa. So just so people know, I don't have any firsthand experience with encampments, right? Except, you know, occasionally stopping when I see the police there, and when I do, and ask, what should I do? Or, you know, are you guys aware of this? Can you respond? Do you have capacity to like deal with this and handle this now? So my experience personally with encampments is very limited.
What should folks do if they pass by and they see an encampment being rousted? What are their options as a house citizen to support?
One is to stop what you're doing and turn on your camera. Like, the camera has become a weapon for the oppressed to use. Even if you cannot stop the eviction itself, your mere presence will have them start acting right. Your camera getting turned on will have them not be as brutal. If you put it on Facebook Live and start calling for advocates to come, maybe more folks start showing, start asking people to show up and stand with you. Really, the presence of housed folks changes everything. And then if anything, we have now documentation so that folks who are in that encampment can actually now file a lawsuit for how they've been abused. So that's the best thing. It's like, just like it's a basic cop watch moment, right? Get out your car and turn on your camera.
Now, who are the organizations to which folks can share this information or witness these processes who are defending folks in civil court against these violations? Can you name some of those organizations, either of you?
Well, the village is engaged with helping folks file lawsuits. And in terms of eviction defense, it's the village, Love and Justice in the Streets, and the East Oakland Collective. And Punks with Lunches just got started with doing eviction defense as well. But those 4 organizations are all grassroots groups, all run by volunteers, and we're in the trenches every day. But if in terms of helping folks file lawsuits, the village in Oakland would be the organization to send that to, and we will try to get it to the proper channels of legal support.
Okay, so you've given us that they can follow you on Instagram at Village Oakland. What's your email address?
It's villageoakland@gmail.com.
villageoakland@gmail.com. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next stage. Once our neighbors have been rousted from the cloister of their tent villages and their outdoor homes, I know that in the past, particularly in Christine's experience and your experience, there have been folks who opened up unoccupied houses in order that folks are not wandering the streets aimlessly. And given that we have a large stock of unoccupied homes, I want each of you to talk a little bit about your experience with opening up what some folks call squats. Maybe I'll start with Christine on this one.
Well, so our family made the move that we did out of absolute necessity. And the first house that we opened was about 5 years ago. And I had no idea what I was doing. And I was just, fumbling around and trying to figure it out as I went. But I did learn a lot in the process. And, one of the primary things that I learned, or this was obvious to me, but it might not be obvious to everybody, is that you need people with privilege on the front line opening the houses. So, you know, skin privilege, education privilege, class privilege. People like Needa B said, who, you know, aren't in a position where this could be their third strike, right? People who aren't already criminalized just because of their skin. So it's really important to have people who recognize that privilege and who, you know, through a training can help to actually open the door. But there's a lot of work that goes on before you open the door, right? There's research. In our case, we didn't know to do research. We were just desperate. We were looking for a house, and, you know, somebody like let us know of a house that was available and had just been shuttered up because the people who'd squatted it before were pushed out. Yeah, it's kind of a long conversation because there's lots of strategies and tactics and things. I personally wouldn't encourage somebody to do what I did, which is just fumble around, because there's a lot of risk there. Of course, if your risk is homelessness, but what I would say too is that there are a lot of groups now, like 5 years ago, before we opened our first house, we approached all the housing rights organizations that we were members of. And we were members of quite a few because we had just navigated an eviction, and that's, you know, the circumstance that landed us in the situation that we were in. So we were already like well plugged in. And at that time, people are like, whoa, that's crazy talk. You know, we were walked out of a law center. I was, for like asking questions because I hadn't actually done it yet. I was like, how do I? And they're like, you do not walk in here and ask us how to break the law. That's not what you do. So bye. And they walked me out. But there are lots of, I don't know about lots. There are people among you who have this skill and who, you know, have navigated and who can help and support you. Yeah, that's what I would say.
So Needa, what about you? What's your experience with squats, given that this might be a real need at this point, given the wave of evictions that are coming, even after the rousting of all the current camps? You're on mute, my dear.
I've attempted adverse possession several times in my life. When me and my daughter first became unhoused, we were squatting in abandoned apartments, abandoned houses, until we were able to get a camper, which is what we're housed in now, as a camper. And there is the funny thing that what Christine just said about she was getting escorted out, about breaking the law. The reality is the average possession law, if you follow it to a T, it is not breaking the law. It was actually created for white settlers to be able to homestead properties and to take native people's hands.
You have to trespass to get in the door, right? So the act of trespassing is breaking the law, and that's pretty high risk.
It depends on how you do it. There's loopholes into everything. The most important thing to do is to establish yourself as a resident. And it takes 30 days to do that. And you don't even have to be on the property for the first 30 days while you establish yourself as a resident. These are all things that we can go into in our trainings. That's generally what I've done every time I've done adverse possession.
Yikes.
We take properties, the properties that we look for are either owned by the banks or owned by development companies. Occasionally, we will take properties that are owned by folks from the neighborhood who have not paid their taxes. And in those situations, I literally look for the owners to find out, one, can we work out a deal and help you pay off your taxes? And either we will become your tenants, or will you consider putting your home into a land trust or a collective land trust that, you know, we're currently forming, so that you won't ever lose your home and it becomes part of this bigger piece of equity. Every time that I've been able to take over a home with adverse possession, they weren't able to move me out. The only times that I've actually moved out is because I finally found the families. On one occasion, the family did want to work with us, and I had taken over a multiple unit house that I was able to move in several senior citizens into. because the family didn't want to lose their house. They hadn't even realized that their house was going onto auction. So that's another thing, is I look at properties on auction. And so that was an example of, we took over a house, I squatted in it. Me and my family tried to improve the situation. I kept on trying to find the owners. I found the owners. They were hella grateful, and they worked it out, and we still have people living in those houses. In another one that I took this year for my daughter's 18th birthday, that's what we did. For her 18th birthday, we took over a house, and I looked and looked and looked for the owners. We were in the house for a good 6 months. I looked for the owners before we moved into the house. We were in the house for a good 6 months until I found the son. Both his parents had died. The house was up for auction. They didn't even realize that they were losing the house. A developer, I forgot their name. It'll come up for me. One of the main developers who's around here, like land grabbing, it was doing the same thing we were doing, which was following the auction. They put their real estate sign on the property. And even though it wasn't theirs to sell, because it had not yet been sold for auction, they were trying to sell the property before it had even been auctioned off through the county. After living in the house for 6 months, I finally found the only living son of the couple. And I told him what was happening, and he was emotionally attached to the house and freaked out, totally freaked out. Was like, "You're stealing the house." I'm like, "Well, actually, no. I mean, I was trying to steal the house. I wouldn't be looking for you. I wouldn't be talking to you." He could not get us out of the house legally. The sheriffs came. They could not get us out of the house legally, because legally, I followed everything. I was now a resident. He would have to take me to court. But because of our principles, we're not trying to harm other Black and brown families. We're trying to work with them. And because he was freaking out so much, he couldn't really wrap his head around the fact that we actually got his house off of the auction list, and that we were willing to pay his back taxes, and that we had actually done work on the house to repair it free of charge, and that we were willing to pay him rent or even have him join our land trust that we're forming. None of that could get over his emotional kind of trauma he was going through, that somebody had moved into his mama's house. And because we talked to him and whatnot, because he couldn't get to go over that, I willingly left the house with my family. He lost the house after that. It's gone. He lost it. The county took it, sold it to the developer who was trying to steal it from him. So each single squat is going to have its completely different story. Every squat is different. Every circumstance is different. And arming yourself with the law and knowing exactly what the law is the best thing you can do, so that you know how to navigate.
So two things in response to that. One is, I think that Christine has a response that I want to give her space to give. But second, I want you to repeat where people go to learn about the law around the squat and around the support that the squat might be able to offer to folks who are being turned back out onto the pavement. Where do people go?
For adverse possession, you can actually look up adverse possession laws, but if you'd like to go to one of the trainings that we're going to be providing, if you text HOMESNOW, one word, all capitals, to 797979, you will be added to our emergency communication system, and you'll find out about the trainings that happen.
Yeah, and you mentioned something really interesting about the real estate company putting their sign on the house. Actually, a lot of these large real estate companies are using adverse possession to own folks' houses. And so, as we mentioned in a lot of our other work, if the bad people are pushing the limits of the law, but staying just within it, we should be learning, informing one another on how to push the limits of the law while staying just within it. Christine, I think you had some feedback on some of this. As a new law student and as a formerly unhoused person who moved through this gamut of squats and then tenant organizing.
I had something I was going to say at the very beginning, which I should have said, which is that I'm not a lawyer, and none of this should be, received or perceived as legal advice. And I say that in large part because we have a comrade, Stephen DiCaprio, who went through the same program that I'm going through with a different organization, but it's the law study program where, you know, you study for 4 years under an attorney, and eventually once prepared, you take the bar, and if you pass, you are licensed to practice law. Even though our friend Stephen went through that process, the bar is denying him his right to practice law, and they're using situations like this. They use, you know, trainings and things that he engaged in and provided as a reason that he shouldn't be allowed to practice law now. So I want to give that disclaimer. And I also want to say that I don't feel like we've given a very robust squatting training today, right? The focus is on this emergency situation that people are going through. And so I would caution people, this was not a training, right? Needa, we agree. This is not a training. This is like a casual conversation. The Sustainable Economies Law Center is going to host Stephen DiCaprio the week before Thanksgiving. We're calling it Teach Giving, and his piece is Teach Taking, because he's gonna give you the nitty gritty on adverse possession. Like, he is actually successfully claimed a property through adverse possession. The things that I know about are really just squatting, right? Like, when my family opened a house, we didn't do it because we had this like master plan to own the property. We just needed shelter. And it wasn't until a year in where the bank showed up and cherry picked all of our personal belongings, changed the locks, that my family and I were like, wow, you know, we need like where do we turn, right? So we had reached out to a lot of organizations before we took our action, and then after, you know, we settled in. But squatting is tricky. You have to be there all of the time, otherwise you run the risk of what I just described to you. Needa said that you can, you know, sorry, I thought somebody said, Needa said that you can establish residency before moving in, which is true, and you are still a trespasser. So, you know, when the police came to our house after we were only there for, actually they came on the first day. That was a tricky situation to navigate. But once they left, we felt like we could, you know, exhale and know that we understood our standing, that they had already come on property, that already told the party who called, which was a neighbor, that she should leave us alone, that, you know, they weren't going to challenge our right to be there, and they were only going to listen to an owner if you know, such party expressed concern. So
can you give us the website where folks can register for the Thanksgiving?
I wish that I could, but we don't have the promotion put together just yet.
Okay. When you do, thank you. Shreya's given it to us. The Selk, www.theselk.org.
Thank you, Shreya. Yeah, so if you check next week, it should be live on there. If anyone wants to attend that training, I highly recommend it. We sought Stephen out for a couple of reasons, but one of them was to just normalize. We were looking for a community so we could normalize this for our kids who were having a real challenge with it.
All right, I'm gonna pass it back to Shreya. We appreciate you guys taking time to just inform us about the situation and giving us some resources where we can receive a safe and legal training on how to support our unhoused neighbors. You have the information to contact them in the chat, and we'll be posting this tomorrow on our Facebook page, and I'll hand it back to Shreya.
Awesome, thank you so much. Thank you to Christine, thank you to Needa B for all that you are and all that you continue to do in the ways that you show up in the movement and in your lives. It's, you know, definitely today has just been the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much here and so much healing that we're all moving through together. So I want to say thank you to everybody that joined us, that is ready to start stepping up in these ways. And thank you again, Christine and Needa B, for giving us, you know, really like direct calls to action and directives on, you know, all be stepping up at this time. Again, we have, you know, the Village Oakland info here in the chat. You can text HOMESNOW to 797979 and stay tapped in by text. We also have the South Radical Real Estate Law School, which Christine is leading, in the chat, so you can feel free to stay connected that way. And definitely once that event is live, that Stephen DiCaprio is speaking at, we will definitely share that out with you all as well. So thank you.
It's currently in the middle of their Radical Real Estate Week of seminars that are happening today and right now. So check into their website to see more seminars that are happening on radical ways we can deal with land and housing right now in Oakland and the East Bay. Sorry. So.
Yes.
Okay.
Blessings.
Thank you guys for hosting this and for, you know, making it mainstream conversation, because it's real. Thank you.
Thanks, Needa.
And just in case folks missed the Center for Sustainable Law Center's training, the training that we do, that the Village does, is actually created by Stephen. So it's actually, yeah. So if you guys missed that one, you can, and that's what we've been using in encampments for the past 2 years, is showing folks how to actually do adverse possession using Stephen's training.
Okay.